Hi, everyone. Today is our second episode in our mini series about Tolkien and his influence on Ren and Helevorn. Today, we are going into more in depth about how Tolkien's works influenced Helevorn's works. So, the first question I have here is Tolkien's world building is inspired from history and medieval literature, particularly Old Norse. How do you see this influence in his writings?
Right. This is it's great to be here and talk about Tolkien again because he is one of my favorite writers ever, and like I said last time, the one who influenced me the most. And well, even my name Helevorn comes from a place in Tolkien's Legendarium. It was a lake. It means black glass. So back when I was a teenager and I was really fascinated and discovering all the lore. I really loved the sound of it and what it means as a name for a lake. So I started using this as my username. So yeah, this is why I've been using this for, I don't even know how many years, but it's something like, I don't know, since before 2010. So yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
Right. And you also started out on DeviantArt with a lot of Tolkien fan art, right?
Indeed, that was before I started drawing my own characters. I was drawing mostly fan art and things that inspired me, a lot of my interpretations of Norse mythology, for example. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and I'm going to show you on my DeviantArt page, Helevorn Art, a few drawings that I have with Tolkien's characters. They're obviously from the movies and not directly as how I imagined them from the books. But yeah, you can see here Gandalf, Glowing, Arwen, the Witch King, and Luthien from the story of Beren and Luthien. And then we have from The Hobbit, we have Glóin, and here Balin. So and Thranduil, sorry, the Elven King Thranduil,
Mhm.
this one. So I also used to do maps because I was fascinated by Tolkien's maps. So here I have a really huge map of Middle Earth, which I really enjoyed drawing. It was really big. I sold it on
Wow.
Etsy, so I don't have it. But this was really difficult to make because it had a lot of details and because the paper was very rough and textured. It was sort of felt like a textile map. So
Wow.
it was really interesting, but it was kind of difficult to make. If I were to make it again, I would know how to better work with that kind of paper right now, so as not to take so many hours that it did. But I remember that I was playing the soundtrack from Lord of the Rings over and over again while doing this. So yeah. Um,
Wow.
yeah, so this is from the time when I was a huge fan, and I still am, but I was manifesting it in my works, in my writing, in my illustrations, sorry. And now I'm
Mhm.
mostly illustrating my own characters, as you know.
Right, right. So that was a great starting point. So Tolkien not only influenced you to think more about the themes and the historical aspects of your own work, but also in terms of, I would say, scope, right? World building, because you were fascinated by his maps.
Oh, yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Right. So world building is something that we don't often hear in regards to historical works. We usually associate it with fantasy or alternative history. So, is it because your own writings draw on the same source as Tolkien of Old Norse literature? And this is why you, like him, kind of did a little bit of world building in your own historical series, even though it is not fantasy.
I think it may be true. And also, I think that further a setting is to the present day, the more world building you need, because the world was much more different from our own. So you have to do more in the way of explaining it to the readers. So because I write about the Middle Ages, then yes, I think that I do need more world building than I would if I was writing in, say, Victorian England.
Right.
So yeah, and this is definitely one of the reasons.
Right. And I think world building is necessary to, give yourself an idea of how your characters are going to act and what kind of clothes they will wear. And, just like kind of give a feel of immersion for yourself and later the reader. At the same time, you don't want to overwhelm your reader with too much information.
Yeah, exactly, yes. So this is how I learned from Tolkien and the way in which he did his own world building, because, or at least in the way he drew his inspiration from the Old Norse literature, because he did not copy paste that information that he was reading and that he knew very well as a specialist in Old Norse himself. He just sort of translated it into his own world so that you don't immediately recognize that it is so influenced from the Old Norse world. And
Mhm.
in a way, I think this is sort of what I did, even though, well, my own world is obviously supposed to be recognizable as medieval Scandinavia, otherwise we have a problem. But what I mean by this is that I always tried not to overwhelm the reader when it comes to the amount of information that I offer, because I think that historical fiction is not supposed to teach the reader what medieval Scandinavia was like, because they can read that in an academic research paper if they want to. But rather what we have to do is give the reader an idea of how the characters acted, how the society worked, what it was like for characters to live there, how did their experiences influence their inner realities.
Mhm.
So this is what is the most important in well, pretty much any work of fiction, I think. And of course, in fantasy literature, you would need more emphasis on world building to, to sort of show off what you did there. But in historical fiction, I don't think it is as important, even though you definitely need more world building for historical fiction than
Mhm.
for anything else other than fantasy, right?
Mhm.
But what Tolkien did, in other words, was capture the essence of the Old Norse world and put it into his writings seamlessly. And this is also what I try to do. This is why in my writings, you are not going to find fragments like this king came to power in this year and he did this and that
Mhm.
he had three sons and they did this and that. This is not the way in which we learn about the history, right? So I'm trying not to do that. We're going to learn through dialogues between other characters and through the plot. So mostly we're focusing on character psychology, character interactions,
Mhm.
and social attitudes.
Right.
So this is something that I was always really fond of. So and this is actually one aspect that I find that some pieces of fiction inspired from the same Norse world are lacking. For example, in a show like Vikings, yes, they do have some facts right, that this guy was a king there and he was fighting the other guy. But then the characters often act very unnaturally and they would say things and do things that no Norse person would do. So I think that is a worse mistake than, messing up the facts a bit,
Mhm.
or
That's
not
true.
being very clear about who was king, or not describing a Viking ship in detail, or the armor, or the
Mhm.
weapons in detail. So yeah, perhaps after you read a novel of mine, will not be able to speak a series of facts about what the weapons were like, and the armor, and Viking ship, and the components of a Viking ship, right? So this is not what you're going to learn, but you're going to have a pretty good impression of how society worked.
Right, exactly. And that's a good balance because I feel like, as you said before, some other books and forms of media, they just focus a lot on the little details. And this is what a lot of people who are not into historical fiction assume historical fiction is all about, just like, a delineation of facts for people who are experts in the area, or people who are really interested in something very specific, like what swords look like in 9th century France or something, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think it's well, it's not really a misconception, because a lot of works of historical fiction are like that, but this doesn't mean that it is really a requirement of the genre. You can take a setting and illustrate it in whatever way you feel relevant.
Exactly. I mean, you could do it with, modern day stuff too. Like someone could just talk about something very, very specialist, like, oh, this is how stocks work in this kind of company organization. And then for like 50 pages, you could do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, exactly.
Not just history, but people are intimidated by history. As I said on the Instagram preview, a lot of people who went to school, they did not like history classes. They thought it was very difficult. There were too many dates to memorize. And I think maybe this influences them to be scared of historical fiction.
Yes, I think so. I think so. When I was in school as well, I was really not fond of historical fiction lessons because
Exactly.
exactly for this reason, because I had to learn all sorts of details that I did not find interesting, and I always found them hard to memorize,
Hmm.
to enumerate things and dates and stuff. So,
Hmm.
but then as I started reading on my own, I realized that I'm very interested in society and mentalities and
Hmm.
behaviors. And so this is what I started to focus on in history as well. And so because I was interested in these things in our own world, this is what I started to see in other periods. What do
Hmm.
people think about this and that in, I
Right.
don't know, what century and culture.
Exactly. So your own writings draw on the same source as Tolkien of Old Norse literature. And was this choice to focus on Old Norse literature in Lucky Wolf and the Sons of Disobedience influenced by Tolkien?
Yes, I think it was very much influenced by him, because before I started reading Tolkien, I wasn't into medieval Scandinavia specifically. I liked history in general. I mean, historical fiction, historical settings in general, but I wasn't really into this. And shortly after I started reading Tolkien, I started listening to Viking metal as well. And I think these were turning points, because it soon became an obsession for me.
Hmm.
This Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon part of the world.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think it was influenced by Tolkien.
Right. Because Tolkien, is he more influenced by Old Norse or
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon, or equally? Because as we talked about before, the dwarves were mostly Old Norse, right? But I think maybe some of the other cultures of Middle Earth were more Anglo-Saxon or Germanic.
Uh, Old Norse is his main influence. Yeah, I think in Tolkien's scholarship, this is the general consensus that Old Norse is his most important influence. Of course, Tolkien did specialize in English philology, but Old Norse was his special subject, so to
Oh.
speak. So he also taught old Icelandic and Germanic philology and Gothic. But of course, he was also a professor of Old English and Middle English. So it was a combination of both. But he was very much passionate about this realm of Old Norse literature, and he founded the Viking Club, it was called, and it was a reader group where people would gather and read Old Norse literature. And he also had another group called the Kolbitar, which means coal biters, which is a name found in sagas. It is in Old Norse, where people who spend a lot of time idling around the fire, telling stories and stuff. And so this was also a group focused on reading Old Norse literature. And he also introduced C.S. Lewis to Old Norse literature. And this is how the Old Norse influences came to be in Lewis's own work.
Right, that's interesting, because both of them in a way were also influenced by Christianity, because both of them were kind of like Christian fantasy authors in a way.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, Tolkien was also always a devout Christian, but then Lewis had his, he was on and off into this, but then somehow his own work was more obviously influenced by Christian mythology overall. So it shows less in Tolkien. Tolkien's, I think, feels much more pagan, so to speak.
That's true. And this is why actually some, conservative Christians, they were okay with Narnia, which was by C.S. Lewis, but they were not okay with Lord of the Rings or anything by Tolkien because it felt more pagan.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. And this is mostly because of the Old Norse influence on Tolkien's writing. So he wanted very much to reproduce or a lot of aspects of it, even though he was sort of reluctant to acknowledge direct overlaps between his writing and his academic career, or so he says in his letters. But it is obvious that so many things are influenced by this. So we mentioned in the Instagram live the so-called catalog of dwarves, which appears in the Poetic Edda in Völuspá. And that was a poem written in the 10th century. And it's sort of so before Norway was and Iceland were converted to Christianity. So there is a whole section dedicated to dwarves where they enumerate names, Thorin, Dwalin, Glóin, Bombur, Balin, I think he's called Blain, not instead of Balin, but Tolkien changed it. And also Gandalf, which is interesting because Gandalf was listed as a dwarf, but his name actually means magic elf. So, and Tolkien made him a wizard, which is a separate race in his mythology. So, so what Tolkien did, he took those names, which are really randomly, they're just enumerated and nothing is said about the dwarves. And then he gave them stories and personalities, and he actually made them characters in his own stories. So this is one of the things, one of the most obvious things that Tolkien takes from that. And of course, there is the Eye of Sauron, which is all-seeing, and it's very much like the Eye of Odin in Old Norse literature. And then we have the Balrog, which is sort of a demon of fire. And we have Surtr, the giant of fire, in the Old Norse world. And then we can also have the dragons, obviously, and this is another thing that Tolkien took from Volsunga saga, for example, the saga of the Volsungs, and they have those unnervingly human-like dragons, as they are called in by Tolkien's scholars, because this is exactly how they appear in Old Norse sources as well. They speak to their slayers, so they have this ability to speak, just as in Tolkien's. We have Smaug in The Hobbit, and we have Glaurung in the Tale of the Children of Húrin. So actually the part with Túrin and Glaurung the dragon is Tolkien's retelling of the saga of the Volsungs. So in a way, they have many similarities. So this is another thing that Tolkien took directly from Old Norse mythology. And then we have something less specific now. There is that scene in The Hobbit, the riddles in the dark part, as the chapter is called, where Bilbo has found the ring and he has it in his pocket, and he meets Gollum, and Gollum is trying he doesn't want to let Bilbo out of the caves. And so they engage in an exchange of riddles. And this is a motif in Old Norse literature very often seen. So even though nowadays we might regard the riddles as something childish, back then it was a thing of wisdom to be able to tell and to answer to riddles. And so often it was this exchange was placed in life threatening situations, so to speak. So the stakes are very high. If you're not able to answer the riddles, you're going to die, for example. And so there is this scene in the saga of King Heidrek where Odin appears in disguise to King Heidrek, and they engage in this series of riddles. And then at the end, because Odin feels like he is losing the game, he says, what did Odin whisper into Baldr's ear when he died? Which is, of course, something that only Odin would know, because, well, Odin whispered something into his dead son's ear, right? So that's not really a riddle, is it? How is anybody else than himself supposed to know? But of course, Odin is in disguise, so King Heidrek doesn't know that he is actually tricking him. And this is exactly what Bilbo does, because he feels that he is losing, and he knows that he would be losing his life. The last riddle that he says is, what have I got in my pocket? And of course, Gollum cannot know what's in his pocket. So this is something that Tolkien directly borrowed from this, and it's very interesting because it's cheating, isn't it? As Gollum would say, it is a tricksy question, right? So, but in Old Norse terms, this is actually Seidr, dark magic, the magic of deceit. This is why Odin is doing it. He's very much a trickster himself. So, well, Seidr is also the kind of magic that Eilf does.
Exactly.
Novel, right? And this is one place where I also borrowed something directly from, well, both Old Norse literature and Tolkien, right? The Game of Riddles, because we have a scene in Lucky Wolf where Eilf is young, and he tells riddles to two young women, well, not young, but two middle-aged women, and then he steals from them. So riddles are paired with wisdom and with playing tricks on somebody, right? Cheating on somebody. So yeah.
That makes sense. I didn't know that so many of these smaller details were directly influenced by, Old Norse things.
Yeah, that's true. So there is a whole worldview put into Tolkien's writings, and it's so formidably well understood and internalized because it's not, some names or
Hmm.
the race of the dwarves or something where he would just copy paste the characteristics, of
Hmm.
something. It's just capturing the essence and that sense of fatalism and heroism, which is also very much in common with the Anglo-Saxon worldview as well, because these two cultures were very similar at the time. They would have been more similar if they had more similar experiences, right? So Norway or Scandinavia in general was more isolated and it was Christian later. So England was also influenced by the continent and by the Christian faith. But if you take all that away, they were actually extremely similar, just as the languages were extremely similar. So sometimes it is difficult to uh, to draw a fine line between what is Anglo-Saxon and what is Old Norse in terms of mentality.
That's true, right? So it's really the superficial stuff that makes them look different.
Yeah, I think so. In some cases, yes.
Hmm. Right. And I think it's interesting how he internalizes a lot of these concepts. So that makes for better world building and it's more smooth and more streamlined. Because, like you said, if he just copy and pasted directly from Old Norse culture, it would just feel like he's superimposing, Norse aesthetics onto something he created himself rather than internalizing it, digesting it, and actually injecting different aspects of it on every level of his world.
Yes, yes, that is very true. That is very true. And that is one reason why so many things, so many fantasy things set about to portray some cultures or openly draw their inspiration from some cultures, then people from those cultures do not feel represented. And I'm thinking here of Disney, for example, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, it's not, well, it's not that well internalized, right? That culture that they are supposed to draw their inspiration from. So but then with Tolkien, well, of course we don't have medieval Scandinavian to really tell us if they feel represented or not, but I think he's doing a great job considering that the information is, well, quite scarce.
That's true. And maybe this is one of the reasons why he chose to turn it into fantasy because it is sparse and he wanted to put
Mm.
his own ideas into it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah,
Did
he
you ever,
wanted to
sorry.
write.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say that he put it in these terms, that he wanted to write a mythology for England. And so he drew
Oh.
inspiration from the Germanic past, which was common, of course, between England and Scandinavia and all Germanic peoples. So this is why he used Old Norse sources, but also Celtic and yeah.
Hmm.
So he was setting about to write a mythology because
Right.
he said, I mean, England did not have as complex a mythology as Scandinavia did. And so this
Hmm.
is what he sort of wanted uh, to do, to accomplish in his writings.
Right. And was there a reason why he chose Scandinavia out of the different Germanic peoples? I think the Anglo-Saxons, like the Saxons at least, were from not from Scandinavia, but from, where Germany is currently.
Yeah, I think that there are more sources to draw on because our main sources for Norse mythology are the Scandinavian ones. Also because they were Christian later, so all of those
Mm.
details were not forgotten as they were on the continent in Germany and England.
Oh, right. That's a good point. Right. And the latest one to convert in Scandinavia is Iceland, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And Iceland had their own sagas, as we talked about before.
Exactly, yeah. So this is perhaps why most of the sagas are from Iceland and
Hmm.
most of the writings that we have in Old Norse.
Right. Was he influenced by Finland? Because Finland is less Germanic because there were Swedish people there, but originally the Finnish people were their own group, which was the Finno-Ugric group, which is similar to Sami people. So did he also have influences from Finland?
Yes, he did, but in a much smaller measure than the others. But he did draw influence from the Kalevala, the national Finnish
Mhm.
epic.
Right. And which culture did he have the most Finnish influence? Was it the elves? I think I read somewhere before.
I think, yeah, I think it was the elves, yes.
Hmm.
I've
Right.
not researched this very much, but yeah, I think it was the elves. Even though the elves and the dwarves are both really Norse races, but yeah, well, we're going to talk about this more.
Right. Are all of the races in Middle Earth mostly Norse, or are there some that are totally not Norse?
Um, well, the hobbits were his own invention, and the orcs, but then the elves and the dwarves are definitely Norse.
I
But
see.
I'm not sure about something like wizards or those um, primordial races.
Like the trees and stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah, I don't really know where he got it from.
How about stuff like the Witch King?
Oh, the Witch King. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, I don't really know. It doesn't look Norse. I
Hmm.
mean, maybe if we see them, the parts where they are cursed kings, ghost kings, then yes, maybe we could say that they are draugr, which are basically the undead who
Hmm.
can be found in burial mounds. So if they have their own burial mounds with riches, then they would probably be dead kings, right? Who are
Right.
somehow made to not rest in afterlife. So if that was his source of inspiration, then yes, it is also Norse. Then he
Mhm.
altered it quite a bit.
Right. And I also thought of the Earl King. I think that's also from Germanic history and mythology, but I don't think it's Norse. I was thinking of the Earl King as a potential inspiration for the Witch King.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a great point. Yes.
Hmm. And Earl King, I think, is mostly from like places like Germany. It's not
Mhm.
from Norse mythology, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Right. And another question we have here is, did Tolkien's dwarves influence your Norse characters in any ways since they are inspired by Norse culture?
Yeah, so to answer the question, we can talk a bit about Tolkien's dwarves. So yeah, he did take them directly from Norse myth, but it's interesting that well, the elves and the dwarves in Norse mythology are not so clearly delineated as they are in Tolkien's. About the elves, we know very, very little from Norse mythology. So basically, Tolkien took the dwarves sort of as they were, because they were master craftsmen, just like Tolkien represented them, with an affinity for metalworking and mining. And they were also very greedy, and they could trick people into different things. And they also had magical powers. They could transform, for example, the dragon Fafnir, who fights Sigurd of the Volsungs, is a dwarf. And he has a brother who can transform into an otter. And then there are other dwarves who can transform into objects. So they also have magical
Mhm.
powers. And they are shown in myths building things that are also imbued with magical power. So most of the artifacts that the Norse gods have come from the dwarves, were forged by the dwarves. And we see that Freya, the goddess of fertility, she often sleeps with dwarves in order to have jewelry made by them, because dwarvish jewelry was excellent and it had magical powers. So yeah, this is sort of how the dwarves are presented in Norse myth, and they and they trick people. They are very cunning as well. And about the elves, we actually know very little, but we see what Tolkien did with them, and he presented in his own way, and he made elves his own. So well, to answer the question, well, they are inspired from Norse mythology, and I don't have that much inspiration from Norse mythology, but I really, really love the mechanism, what Tolkien did there, how he took those characters and made them his own. So I guess in terms of this mechanism of creating characters, then maybe in that way.
Mm-hmm. Right, definitely. So it was mostly just about the character creation process rather than, anything specific about a particular character Tolkien had that influenced yours.
Yes, I think so, because Tolkien basically took characters or races which are mostly symbolic in Norse mythology, and then he gave them personalities. So yes, his dwarves are characterized by the same passion for crafting and mining and all that, but then he also gives them separate personalities. So sure, they have racial traits, but then they are their own people. So I guess in this way, this is what I did with my characters as well, because I have a lot of Viking warriors, but then they are not similar to each other, all of them. And when I say Viking, I mean the people who go raiding. Even though I have several characters who are actually into this activity, their views on the activity itself and on everything else are very different.
Exactly.
So they're just not meant to be symbols, but you
Right.
make them people.
Right, exactly. So, example would be Ingvar versus Hakon.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
And another class of people you have in your series is seers, Eyjolf's foster mother and himself, and Valdis.
Yeah, that's very true. And I also try to make their worldviews different from each other, because in Norse sources, there is no general characteristic of seers. Yes, maybe they are generally seen as cunning people, so you shouldn't trust everything they say, but beyond that, they are not presented as very similar to each other. They are, yes, they do mostly appear as symbols, so not many of them have personalities, but this is what I tried to reflect, how they approach their profession differently.
Finally, as we kind of touched upon at the beginning of this podcast, what similarities between historical and fantasy world building are there? How does research inform both, and what are the differences?
So I think that these are two genres which are quite similar, because they bring in front of the reader, like we said, situations that you would never been, and places that you will never see, and a world which often functions under rules different from our own. So for these reasons, I think these genres are not for everyone, because the leap in imagination and immersion has to be greater for, say, a story taking place in present day London or New York, or some other place that we've seen a lot of movies and a lot of fiction on. And sometimes we feel like we know that place even though we don't really know it. So for these two genres, you need that much discussed willing suspension of disbelief that Coleridge was talking about, right? To infuse a human interest and a semblance of truth into a fantasy setting so as to help the reader connect with all those otherworldly things. So in this way, yeah, they are very similar, and you have to be quite rigorous in both world building and the way in which you deliver that to the reader so as to keep that emotion and immersion in spite of the amount of world building. So yeah, this is definitely one similarity.
Mm-hmm. Did you do more world building for Sons of Disobedience or Lucky Wolf?
Definitely Sons of Disobedience, because Lucky Wolf focuses on two characters, Aelf and Dingbot, whereas Sons of Disobedience has a greater scope in itself because it shows the process of Christianity, the conversion to Christianity of Norway, and how we have King Olaf trying to accomplish this on the one hand, and then we have the dissidents on the others. So on the other hand, so it's supposed to show more characters and the whole country instead of just two people. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely greater in scope, and this is why it requires quite a bit of world building, and it's much more difficult to write. And as you know, I've been working on and off on this for more than 10 years now. And this is why I've had to distance myself from it, because I felt that there was so much world building and so many characters, and I needed first to really know them and to really know the world that I'm writing about before actually writing the novel, because my first attempt was pretty messy. So I want my second attempt to be more like Lucky Wolf, but at a greater scale.
Right.
But keep the same level of reader's connection to the characters.
Right. I think it's harder to do because there's so many characters, as you discussed, and 3 viewpoints, not just, 2.
Yeah, that's true. And it's sort of similar to the difference between Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, right? Because The Hobbit is more focused on a group of characters and doesn't really show the whole scale, but then The Lord of the Rings show the whole world, struggling with Sauron, and it's on a much grander scale.
Absolutely. As Ren said last time, The Hobbit is much more micro and more intimate because it's one person's journey, not, a billion different people's perspectives and journeys.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And I guess, just to see the books behind you, I think we see Lucky Wolf in hard copy and a bunch of Tolkien books.
Oh yeah, that's right, exactly. So we have the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, the Book of Lost Tales in 2 volumes, the Silmarillion, and the Hobbit. And then here we also have Finding Sam.
Yes, I saw it. Yes, it's very exciting to see all of them on the shelf.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, me too.
I know, it's amazing. Congratulations on having it printed out again.
Thank you so much. And the same to you with Finding Sam. It's great to see them side by side.
It is. It's very exciting. But yes, do you think there's any other points you want to cover, or is this about it for this podcast?
Of course, there are always more things to cover, but I think that we have summed it up all right.
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe we can have more Tolkien podcasts in the future, maybe talking about the cultures in Middle Earth in more depth and maybe comparing them to, your own work.
Yeah, that's true. Or we could just choose some stories, like the book reviews that we did, and we can review one specific book or one specific story. I'm mainly thinking about The Children of Húrin, which I mentioned that I'm very fond of last time.
Exactly. So we could talk about that. That would be very interesting.
Yeah, indeed.
Right. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, goodbye.